Hi, I'm Kevin Dugan, and this is Ben Serpa. Dr. Ann Jefferson is the Associate Professor in the Department of Geology at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. Before that, she received her master's in water resource science, and then after that, she earned a PhD in geology at Oregon State University in 2006. Dr. Jefferson's research focuses on urban watersheds and stormwater management, hydrologic responses to climate variability and change, and landscape evolution. The goal of her research is to improve the resilience and sustainability of water resources in aquatic ecosystems in the Anthropocene.
Dr. Jefferson engages in interdisciplinary collaboration with ecologists, scientists, engineers, and architects. Her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. Geological Survey, among other organizations. Dr. Jefferson was a Leshner Leadership Institute Public Engagement Fellow of the American Association for Advancement of Science in 2016-2017. Her public engagement portfolio includes work in national and regional parks, K-12 teacher professional development workshops, and interaction with journalists, and is actively engaged on social media. She's on Twitter at HighlyAnn. And with that, we give you Dr. Jefferson.
So much for the introduction. You can definitely all hear me, so that's a good start. Okay, so it is a delight to be here today. I was telling the students beforehand that I think the last time I was in this area, I was in maybe 7th grade, and I got a really bad sunburn at Lake Tahoe and saw my first wildfire. So I know nothing about this area, and it's been really wonderful to get to know the area a little bit this morning and to talk with the many great students, faculty, and researchers that are here. But now I have my work cut out for me because I need to convince you that what we should be as a hydrologic science community focusing on in some serious way over the next few decades and beyond is the hydrology of urban watersheds. And let me say that I had to come to this realization post-graduate school. In graduate school, I worked in designated wilderness areas, and I thought that people who studied urban streams were suckers. Didn't they know that the real hydrology happened up in the mountains? And then I got my first faculty job at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, where there was no volcanoes, which is what I'd studied, no snow, which is what I'd studied, and no big springs, which is what I'd studied. So what the heck was I gonna do? But this is what we had. This is Little Sugar Creek. This is downtown Charlotte in the background. And so the streams, this was a rapidly growing urban area, the streams were really impacted by urbanization. And in fact, in this picture, this is a beautiful stream restoration. 5 years before this picture was taken, this stream was buried under a parking garage for a dilapidated mall and was subject to flooding. So that's a little bit of the motivation for studying urban watersheds, in that they're where we are and we are interacting with them, whether we think about it or not. So you might think that you know what you need to know about urban watersheds because you've seen a diagram that might look like this. So the essence of this diagram is that we have some sort of natural vegetation, and it partitions and landscape, and it partitions the flow. A lot of it infiltrates, some of it runs off, a lot of it is evapotranspired, and then we pave paradise, we put up a parking lot, we increase what we call impervious surfaces, and that causes more surface runoff. And it shifts our stream hydrograph from something that rises slowly and falls slowly and sustains base flow to something that rises very rapidly to high peak flows and base flow goes way down. Okay, that's fine. I'm glad we all know that. There is a lot more to urban hydrology and urban watersheds than this diagram. And in fact, this is the only time you're going to really see me invoking this concept today. So let me make the case for urban hydrology. So I know that Sally Thompson was here last week and was talking about the critical zone, so let's start with the critical zone. We have the critical zone in urban watersheds. We have rocks, we have soil, we have vegetation, we have climate. Just because we've urbanized, it does not take away the underlying natural characteristics of our region. But why do we work on urban watersheds? It's where we live. right? People are there, so they're really important to us. We not only have the natural complexity, but now we have the built complexity. We are adding subdivisions, and if this is Reno, these must be casinos and high-rise hotels. You know, there's a lot of heterogeneity that we add to the land surface, and we also add it to the subsurface. We have pipes bringing treated water in, gas lines in, our sewage out. A lot of those times, those might cross topographic divides, so we have interbasin water transfers happening right and left in urban watersheds. So there's a lot of complexity in the urban environment. We're also tightly coupled with human systems. We cannot escape the humans in the urban environment. And these humans, as individuals and as groups, are making decisions that are affecting the management of the natural resources and the built environment. So we cannot study urban watersheds as if there weren't active decisions being made about how to manage these systems. Finally, working where the people are aligns us with other disciplines. All right, so I think normally that might say Las Vegas, but we're gonna talk about the Anthropocene because the place where our changing climate is gonna have its most significant impacts are the places where people are living, right? That's where we're gonna feel the effects. And so integrating hydrology into that conversation is an important thing that urban hydrology lets us do. And then finally, it makes us relevant to policymakers, right? We can make arguments that we need to pay attention to hydrologic science because that's gonna tell us about flood risks on the Truckee River, or stormwater runoff, or adequate drinking water supplies for the arid West, right? Those are the things that are gonna hook policymakers on supporting hydrologic science research, on supporting the USGS stream gauge network, all the things that we want from policymakers. Urban hydrology gives us the buy-in to get there. So let me break some of these things down a little bit more and give you the sort of one slide per bullet point level of argument for urban hydrology. Again, this is where we live. Charlotte, I think, is something like the 20th biggest urban area in the United States, but it doesn't really matter. The point is there are a lot of big cities in the United States. Over 80% of Americans live in urban areas, and those occupy less than 3.5% of the United States surface area. And that's just the contiguous states. That's even excluding Alaska, all right? And this is projected to continue to increase. By 2050, it'll be 87% of Americans. Globally, more than half of the population lives in urban areas, right? And again, that is projected to increase. We're also now seeing cities that are containing 15 or 20 million people, and they're still growing rapidly. So here's where I put a disclaimer in and tell you that my work is very American and developed world focused, and that there are real issues around urban hydrology and the provision of water infrastructure and sanitation in the developing world that would fall under the umbrella of urban hydrology, but in which I am in no way an expert. So we're gonna set those aside for this talk and focus on urban watershed hydrology as it applies to us here in the developed world. All right, so cities are big, people are living in them, but they are not monoliths. So these are two places where I've lived and worked. I liken Charlotte to the tumor or the cancer cell growing and swallowing up all of the farmland and the forest around it. So that population growth has been rapid, but the amount of land area per person in this urban region has also been increasing over the last several decades. Right? So we're moving out to the suburbs, and we're moving from the suburbs to the exurbs, and each time the urban footprint is increasing. I then moved from Charlotte to northeastern Ohio, where I live now. I live about here. And we have Cleveland and Akron, and those are shrinking cities, places where the population is moving out, but the urban infrastructure is still built, and it's still affecting the hydrology. But the cities aren't really shrinking in the metropolitan sense. All this green here, those are areas where the population is increasing. So we have, even with a static population, we have an expanding urban footprint. All right. And again, we have this urban footprint, but it's on top of the naturally variable climate and landscape. So we have geology affecting topography, affecting soils, affecting the underlying bedrock, the glacial history of a region or not, and then we have climate. And this can mean that the same sorts of urbanization happening in two different areas produces very different hydrologic response. So if we take two cities in the southeastern United States that basically have the same rainfall, where did Austin go? Same climate regime. If we look at the response in base flow or groundwater recharge in these two cities, we see big declines in base flow and groundwater recharge in Atlanta and huge increases in Austin. What's the difference? It's not that people are any different in those two cities, it's that Austin is built on limestone and karst, and water that goes into the soils goes down into the bedrock and supports the streams. Atlanta is built on crystalline rocks with clay soils, and water tends to run off much more. Similarly, we would say in general that high flows increase as we increase urbanization, but the shape of that increase, is it a linear response with increasing urbanization intensity, or is there some sort of threshold response, or is it something even different? Again, that's going to vary by region. And some folks, Brian Miles and Larry Band, have proposed this idea of landscape capacitance, which is sort of the hydrologic ability of a landscape to absorb a land use change or urbanization without affecting the hydrology. So our underlying natural characteristics plus our climate are going to affect the hydrology we get in urban areas. Meredith Steele has done some really interesting work on just looking at the shape and distribution of water bodies in different environments. So this is sort of taking our natural environment times the land use decisions we make when we urbanize and looking at the hydrologic response. So this is one figure from one of her papers. So what we're seeing here, things have gotten a little cut off. We've lost some axes. But this should be the urban water density, body density pre-development versus post-development. And so what we see is that in dry areas, when you urbanize them, you get a higher number of water bodies in that landscape. And in wet areas, you get fewer of them. So that's an idea that there's sort of a convergence in the density of water bodies, number of water bodies, area of individual water bodies, or a homogenization of surface water expression as a result of urbanization. And that work aligns with some work that Peter Groffman and colleagues have done, and they've proposed this idea of ecological homogenization of the urban environment across cities, so that Phoenix and Baltimore might look more like each other in the urban area than they look like their natural counterparts outside. However, if you go a few more figures in Meredith's work, you can kind of come up with a different interpretation. So here she's plotting a change in water body area versus a change in water body density. And so some areas are getting wetter and some areas are getting drier. Sometimes water bodies are becoming more consolidated and sometimes they're becoming more fragmented. So they're all ending up looking more like each other, but the pathways or the impacts of the urbanization on the natural landscape are quite different. And you can see some regional patterns here. So the southeast and the west is getting wetter, and the Midwest is getting more consolidated. Well, what's driving that? Again, it's not the people that are different there, or it's what we were given, what the landscape provided in terms of water bodies to start with. So that segues nicely into another level of heterogeneity, the built complexity of the environment. So this is my old subdivision in Charlotte. This is downtown Cleveland. Obviously, the intensity of the development in these two areas is quite different. The age of development is quite different. Whether we are talking about changing urban hydrology by sort of going from forest and farmland to urban, or whether we're talking about redeveloping brownfields or abandoned industrial sites, that's a really different proposition in terms of the potential hydrologic ramifications. Even within a city, we have land use variability, right? So here's a neighborhood here, probably about 45-50% impervious surface cover, all fragmented up into little tiny backyards and front yards. This colorful area here is an industrial site, 62 acres, 52% impervious, but our impervious surface now comes in much larger chunks. This is a 6-acre rooftop. It is enormous, right? And so the hydrologic impacts of this 50% impervious versus this 50% impervious is probably really different just because of the spatial arrangement of the imperviousness. Oh, and by the way, you can't dig in the ground here because of legacy contamination issues, and you can't export any materials off-site. So we also have water quality. While I'm focused on water quantity, we also have all these water quality repercussions of urbanization and different land use histories and land use choices. It doesn't stop at the subsurface or the surface. Our subsurface architecture is also dramatically changing the hydrologic response in urban areas. So we have storm drainage, which is basically designed to efficiently shed water from parking lots and rooftops into the nearest water body by piping it, right? We're really increasing the drainage efficiency of the landscape. We also have wastewater. In a new modern city, we would send our wastewater to the wastewater treatment plant, where it would then form a point source of discharge to a local water body. All right, so we're potentially, again, having an interbasin water transfer and a big point source of discharge that you wouldn't pick out on a map of the stream network. In older cities like Cleveland and 772 other cities in the United States and thousands of cities around the world, there are these fun systems called combined sewer systems. So in this system, your stormwater and your wastewater go into the same set of pipes. If it's not raining very hard, all of those pipes go to the wastewater treatment plant and then get dumped out into a river or lake. So now we've taken all of this potential runoff or recharge from this part of the landscape and exported it to wherever the wastewater treatment plant happens to discharge. When it rains too hard, in order to avoid overflowing the wastewater treatment plant or backing sewage up into your basements, there are these nice valve structures here where this super yummy mix of stormwater plus sewage gets discharged untreated to your river or lake. Again, pretty big water quality, public health implications of that, but also some redistribution of water around the landscape in a way that is totally novel and that we wouldn't see in an undeveloped watershed. Finally, pipes leak. They leak a lot. A good American city loses about 10% of its municipal treated tap water supply. Like on its way from the water treatment plant to your house, you lose about 10% of the water. In older cities, it can be 25%. Cities in the developing world can lose nearly all of their treated water. Why is that? Because their water supply pipes are pressurized, so they will tend to leak out. And they are sometimes above the water table, so again, they'll leak out and they'll recharge groundwater. Fortunately, our sewer pipes are not pressurized, so they tend to leak in, but now we are discharging groundwater to our sewer pipes and sending that to the wastewater treatment plant, and then out to wherever the wastewater treatment plant goes. And storm drains, same thing. We might be exporting a stormwater thing that is actually not ever really been surface runoff. The magnitude of these leaks and all of the other subsurface manipulations to hydraulic conductivity, utility trenches, subway systems, basements, all of that sort of thing have caused some hydrologists to describe urbanization as a karstification process. All right. Let's talk about stream channels, right? I haven't seen the Truckee River yet, but I'm hoping to later this afternoon. But we're really fond of manipulating and engineering stream channels in urban areas. These two pictures were taken by my colleague Aditi Bhaskar in the same creek, less than a mile apart. The potential interaction between Little Dry Creek and its riparian zone or groundwater are quite different in these two pictures, right? This is my friend Little Sugar Creek in Charlotte. What is this? This is dry day flow, perennial base flow, coming out of, well, that's not a bridge. That is an opening from a buried reach of stream. Here I am in a buried stream in Raleigh, North Carolina. Again, it hasn't rained in days or weeks, but we are seeing a stream under the subsurface. Many urban areas have lost essentially the entire tip of their drainage network. All your headwater streams are buried in places like Philadelphia and Cleveland and Baltimore. And an even higher percentage of streams have been cut off from interaction with groundwater because of channelization. All right, all of that is about things people build, but people also act, and we make environmental decisions even when we don't think we are making environmental decisions. So individuals and institutions are influencing urban hydrology every day through the things that we do. So institutions, and that could be a homeowners association, that could be a park district, that could be your city council, that could be the state, that could be the federal government. They are making decisions based on rules and regulations. They're making decisions about incentives and who's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. And they're making decisions based on cost, right? And there's some sort of formal framework that's governing a lot of the decision making at the institutional level, but there are also social norms. We're gonna do this because we've always done it that way. How many times have you heard that, right? Same thing applies to the management of urban water. We're not gonna build permeable pavements because we heard that they're a pain to plow in the winter, right? So individuals make decisions about keeping up with norms, keeping up with the Joneses. I better have a nice green lawn in Reno because that's what my neighborhood wants me to have. But institutions also make decisions that way as well. And then we get down to the sort of cognitive factors, people's values, people's knowledge, people's perceptions and attitudes about the environment. Do they consider themselves pro-environment? Do they consider themselves pro-green lawn? How do they perceive things? Is wastewater or stormwater a resource, or is it a problem? Knowledge is one piece of this, and oftentimes our tendency is to come in and say, if you just knew more about water, you would exhibit more pro-environmental behavior. It doesn't work like that. That's a really ineffective communication technique because there is what's known as the knowledge to action gap. And so just increasing people's knowledge of environmental issues does not necessarily translate into action, particularly if that knowledge is at odds with their values and attitudes or with the norms and the rules that they're working under. It's also not listening to the people who are telling you that this is what they perceive or this is what's important to them. So we get much farther when we sort of cross this out and say we're gonna work on all of these other levers rather than just going out and educating people. Although I educate people, right? So I'm working with a group of teachers in that picture. And we're talking about, stream geomorphology and hydrology, and then they're gonna bring that back into their classrooms and work with kids. So there's certainly a role for education as well. And then again, we need to throw the climate dice and see what sort of weather we're given. So this is a picture really near my campus in Charlotte following about 13 inches of rainfall as a result of Tropical Depression Faye in 2008. And if you are not in North Charlotte, you've never heard of Tropical Depression Faye, but it was nothing when it hit land, and then it got all the way up to North Carolina from the Gulf Coast and dropped a lot of water on us. This says, warning, trails subject to flooding, right? Charlotte maintains a swiftwater rescue team to evacuate people from homes and businesses as a result of urban flooding. In Florence, they had it again. They got 6 inches of rainfall. So we have to think about all of these systems responding to a variable and increasingly intense climate. But that's where we can come back to the human systems, because what is Charlotte doing? This, if you look closely, not only is there a trail, but that's the top of a soccer net. This is a really good use of a place that floods because we're not building homes and businesses there. Charlotte is actually aggressively buying out flood-prone homes and businesses and getting people out of the floodplain. So that's a social system working to alter the response to the hydrology. And then by creating floodplain storage, now our peak flows might be somewhat more dissipated as we move farther downstream. All right. So we have all these things happening in urban watersheds, and I was on the plane yesterday, and I was like, well, which is the most important? Can we think about these as sort of a hierarchy of controls in urban hydrology? And this is my personal sort of ranking of things. I think that ultimately, the natural capacitance of the landscape, the geology and the climate, is gonna influence
hydrologic response, right? Reno is never going to be Charlotte. We also have the decisions that we've already made, the legacy land use and infrastructure decisions, the things that are already built. As the shrinking cities are discovering, you don't unbuild pipes and pavement just because people have moved out. Those continue to be there, all right? Then we get the current social systems and the engineering practices that we follow now. These are the decisions we're making today that are going to affect things today and into the future. And then we get the decisions we make about the future. How this could be local sort of level or individual level decisions. I'm not going to buy that house in the floodplain, or as a city, we're going to buy out the floodplain. Or they could be, how are we going to mitigate or adapt to a changing climate, right? So all of this, so this is what I would come up with as sort of a hierarchy of factors influencing urban hydrology. So let's zoom in now a little bit to my research, because of course I can't work on all those things. I think they're all fascinating, and there's things I'd love to even add to those previous slides. But I've really focused my work on stormwater runoff and stormwater management. And again, drawing this idea that one of the fundamental changes that urbanization has on the landscape is increasing the drainage efficiency and the hydrologic connectivity via downspouts and gutters and curb and gutter and storm sewer pipes out to the stream. Right? And that's busy delivering water out to the stream and delivering all of the other yummy things that we put on our landscape, our fertilizers, our dog poop, our brake linings, all of that is coming into our urban watersheds. So this enhanced hydrologic connectivity increases peak flows, it increases bank erosion, it degrades water quality in a whole host of ways, and all of that ultimately sort of flows down and affects stream ecosystems. And ecologists have coined this urban stream syndrome, sort of this host of ills or symptoms that result from urbanization of the landscape. So if you don't think that this is a pretty picture and you're like that fish and you're unhappy and you want to do something about urban stream syndrome, I would argue that the number one thing you need to do is to stop stormwater. We need to keep that runoff out of the urban streams, or at least slow down the flow. Okay, I am not telling you anything new. Luna Leopold published a great paper on hydrology and land use and urban planning in 1968. We have been building stormwater management structures in our urban areas since the 1970s. And they've evolved over time. So a lot of the early generation of stormwater structures, which are still built today, are sort of centralized near the outlet of a neighborhood or a development, or all the way at the end of the Walmart parking lot. And they're focused on detention, on slowing the flow down. There will be some sort of outlet structure in this picture with a pipe of a certain diameter, and the release rate of water from that pond or wetland is controlled by the diameter of the pipe and the hydraulic head. So that's good. It doesn't affect the water balance, but it slows the release rate of the water, and there might be some settling and some biology happening in that pond to change water quality. We could string several of these things together and improve the system, but these days the big vogue thing gets called lots of different names: green infrastructure, low impact development, or source control. And the idea is that rather than waiting for all of that stormwater to get to the end of the neighborhood, we try to stop it very close to the source. So things like infiltration trenches and bioretention cells sprinkled throughout the parking lot, a rain garden in your front yard, a grain roof, all of these are source control. And a lot of the focus on source control is not just slowing the flow, but it's providing opportunities for infiltration or evaporation and water harvest and water reuse. And so they're an attempt to restore the water balance as well as restore the peak flows. Also, they tend to be a little better for water quality as well. Okay, so I told you I was the first person to think of these things. We've built millions of them. By a really rough estimate that I've done, we spend something like $1 billion a year on stormwater management in the United States. And people have been studying them. There are probably thousands of papers out there that have looked at the flow coming into a pond and looked at the flow coming out of the pond, measured some water quality parameters, and said, the pond improves water quality and reduces peak flows. If you boiled all of those thousands of studies down, you would see that for any individual type of stormwater control, that there's a broad range of effects. Some ponds are better than others. Some bioretention cells are better than others. These two bioretention cells, I'm guilty of this, I've been studying some of this at the site scale too. These two bioretention cells are adjacent to each other, but they perform differently because of quirks around the engineering choices and the construction and maintenance of these two systems. And of course, climate and soils and underlying bedrock also matter. So that's fine and good. We know a fair amount about that. The question that really has been driving my research for the past few years is what happens when we start to add lots of these stormwater controls to the landscape. So that's a picture of what the city of Philadelphia wants their future to look like. They have problems with combined sewer overflows. They have problems with stormwater runoff. They want to green the city. Green roofs everywhere, bioretention cells everywhere. We'll get them to what they need to get to in terms of reducing combined sewer overflows? That's a good question. We can't just wait for Philadelphia to do that and say, oh, too bad, so sorry, that didn't work. We would like to be able to draw insights from monitoring data in Philadelphia and other places, from experimental manipulations at larger than the single site scale, and from numerical models to have some understanding of the effects of all of this investment in stormwater management. So with some collaborators, we set out to see if we could identify all of the papers on the cumulative effects of stormwater control in the English language literature. And we were really excited because we found 100 papers. We tried to write a grant to do the synthesis work, and our reviewers said there weren't enough papers, so they wouldn't give us the money. So we showed them we did the work anyways. So 100 papers, we plotted them up on a map, and the good news is, if like me, you live in the eastern United States, we know a fair amount of it. If like you, it's not looking so good for the western United States, and hey, look at the southern hemisphere of the developing world. So there are big geographic disparities on how well we understand this cumulative effects problem. There are also scale disparities. So here's our 100 studies plotted up. Red are modeling studies, blue are empirical studies. Notice the log x-axis on area of the study watershed. So even though we've got 100 studies there and more than 100 dots, because this is per watershed, we have, places where we really don't know, where we have only one sort of bit of information of what we might expect the response to be. All right, well, but what do we know? We know a fair amount about peak flows and about flow volumes, because those are the things our regulations have focused on. However, if you want to know about low flows, groundwater recharge, evapotranspiration, this gets to be pretty sparse. There might only be 2 or 3 or 1 dot on that graph that has actually quantified the effects of stormwater controls on, say, evapotranspiration. And then peak flows. Well, that covers a lot of ground. Is it a whole series of peak flows from a distribution of different size events? Are we talking about the 2-year peak flow, the 100-year peak flow? When we started to really break all of these 100 papers down, we couldn't actually do the quantitative meta-analysis that we wanted to do because there was very little standardization in the metrics that people were reporting. What were the controls? Was your control watershed an undeveloped watershed? Was it a watershed with no stormwater management? And there's no standardization among the studies that are available. So what we eventually came up with was this sort of hypothesis, right? And now the challenge is to put data on our hypothesis. So if we take untreated impervious area and a hydrologic metric of our choice, and let's just take 2-year peak discharge here because we actually have some data. We know that as we increase impervious surfaces, we will tend to increase peak discharge. The shape of that arrow is going to be dependent on that landscape capacitance, right? And all those urbanization and land use choices. If we then, let's say we have a 10 square kilometer watershed and we put in a pond that treats 20 hectares of land, are we going to see the effects of that? Probably not. So if we start to add stormwater management to the system, there's some amount of investment we put in where we can't detect the effects. We don't see the outcome at the stream gauge at the bottom end of the watershed. But if we continue to add stormwater management to the system, we will start to see an effect until eventually we've treated all the impervious area, but we're not quite back to where we started. We expect there to be some residual there because of all of the other things that are sort of changing in the system and the fact that no stormwater control works perfectly, all right? So this is sort of our hypothesis that we've put out there to the hydrologic community and say, show us the data. This is what we've gleaned. We have a bunch of these metrics, a bunch of these figures. Let's see how they work in real places. And a big question that I've been sort of stuck on is, how big is this arrow of detectable effects? How much investment do we need to pour into managing stormwater in urban watersheds before we can go back to our stakeholders and the people that are paying the bills and say, guess what? It's working. Your peak flows are going down, right? Because that's what they really want to know. So I'm going to very quickly tell you 3 stories, one from Charlotte with a series of USGS gauges, one from the Cleveland area where we experimentally manipulated streets so we could do a paired watershed study, and a modeling study that is slowly coming towards review and press, also in the Cleveland area of a larger watershed. Okay, so back to Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte, because of its urban flooding problems, has one of the densest USGS stream gauge networks in the United States. They also, the county, built a comprehensive stormwater control management database, so we were able to know where all the stormwater controls were and how much water they were treating. Because of its urban flooding issues, Charlotte has a stormwater fee and have for more than a decade. They spend $25 million a year as a city county in managing stormwater. So they've poured a huge amount of money into the blue areas on the map, right? And so what you see is, despite this being a relatively new city, there are a lot of areas with impervious surface where stormwater is going unmanaged. So what we wanted to do, we took the USGS gauge data, we calculated all sorts of different hydrologic metrics, and then we wanted to see what were the best predictors of those hydrologic metrics, with the hope that the stormwater controls would show up as good predictors of the hydrology of these urban watersheds. They don't. In every single metric, impervious surface is the #1 predictor of hydrologic response. So I'm just showing you one here. Runoff ratio, and we've had, oh, well, maybe, if we segregate out small storms from big storms, then we'll see something. No, it's just impervious surface. So that's back to slide 2, right? It tells us something about this landscape. It was only when we took the residuals between the individual watersheds and their trend lines that we saw stormwater controls show up. So they show up as a second-order control, and even then, not in every hydrologic metric. Sometimes it's tree cover in the watershed that is important. So what does this tell us? It says that with our existing monitoring network and sort of space for time substitutions and all the quirks of what's happening on the ground, we have a really hard time detecting the signal of stormwater management in this urban area that has invested tens and hundreds of millions of dollars in it. Why is that? Well, so we started to drill into it. So we did some breakpoint analyses, right? And so this is a low impervious watershed and a high impervious watershed, and we plotted up precipitation versus peak discharge. And in this watershed, it can rain up to 10 millimeters, and the stream really doesn't do anything. And above that, stream flow goes up. In this watershed, it can rain less than a millimeter, and then the stream starts to respond, right? And if we plot those breakpoints for all of our 16 watersheds, notice that, again, we're plotting it against impervious surface. It's not stormwater control that shows up, which tells us that the stormwater control that we're putting in the form of ponds and wetlands, is not replacing the storage or the landscape capacity that has been lost as a result of urbanization. All of the topographic roughness and the puddles and canopy interception, all of that sort of vehicles for storing water are being decreased, and our ponds and wetlands are not sufficient to override that signal. All right. Well, that was pretty depressing. So let's control the conditions. Let's build it and see what happens. So now we're up in suburban Cleveland. 1950 is development. We want to put stormwater control in this street, because right now it's just dumping its stormwater straight into a stream inside a park. And so with money from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we designed a paired watershed, a before-after control impact design. But if you're looking at this map, you're going, well, where are they going to put it in, right? So we're focused on Cluster Avenue. That's this street here. That's what we got to work with. We can't build a pond or a wetland at the end. We're going to need to build it in these people's front yards. And so we focused on bioretention cells collecting street runoff. So in this, Clevelanders call this the tree lawn. Akronites, the city to myself, they call it the devil strip. Anyways, that's the area we have to work with, and in a few cases we put rain gardens, and we also gave homeowners rain barrels. So we set up 2 treatment streets, 2 control streets, monitored them for a year, and then went out and tried to convince the homeowners to let us rip up part of their front lawn. There are about 200 houses on Klessner Avenue, and I'm just going to focus on Klessner Avenue. And we succeeded in convincing 12 places, and that wasn't even 12 individual homeowners, but that was just 12 places where we could put bioretention cells in. Those people also got to have up to 4 free rain barrels, so we got rid of 22 of those. And 2 people had nice street trees, so we put a rain garden in the front yard instead. The rest of the people, we knocked on doors, we flyered, we had town halls. We could not get anybody else to participate. Until they saw their neighbors getting these free gardens, and then they started calling us. Hey, why didn't you ever tell us about that? So phase 2 happened because we had money left, and we built some more street-side bioretentions. We changed the engineering of them a little bit. We got rid of some more rain barrels and built some more rain gardens in front yards and backyards. The plants, this is the same rain garden in 2013. Here it is in 2014. It was great. We got, as a total, 12.5% homeowner participation. Let me give you this for free. Oh, we'll take care of it too. 12.5%. But it worked, yay! So this is our control watershed. This is our treatment watershed. We have our pre-treatment data, and our phase 1 data looks just like our pre-treatment data, but phase 2 is lower volumes of storm flow in our storm sewers from the system, and that is a statistically significant difference. So it's decreasing by up to 40%. The peak flow data is messy because real world data is messy. In our pre-treatment period, we didn't get any storms that generated high peak flows. But we see this shift downward between phase 1 and phase 2 in our larger storms, and no significant difference in our little storms, which is sort of interesting. So now we have to interpret this. So why did phase 2 work so much better? So this is a cross-section through a bioretention cell, and in phase 1, all of the bioretention cells had this overflow inlet and this perforated pipe plugged back into the storm sewers. So if water infiltrated down and then entered that pipe, it could go back to the storm sewers. In phase 2, we didn't build that in there because it saved us money, and it turned out that we didn't really think we needed them. So now any water that flows into a bioretention cell in phase 2 has no opportunity to return to the storm sewers, and therefore our volumes are going down more dramatically, and our peak flows go down. Because in phase 1, we had curb cuts and this gravel superhighway channel running right to our overflow inlet. In phase 2, no underdrain, therefore no overflow inlet, therefore no gravel, superhighway. Now water is forced to spread out and infiltrate. Why did we see effects in big storms and not little? It takes a certain amount of depth along the curb for water to actually turn the corner and go across that slightly rough curb cut and into the bioretention zone. My poor grad student went out there and stood on the street a lot of times in the rain to figure this out, right? So if it's raining lightly, the water just continues on to the storm sewer catch basin. But if it's raining hard and the depth of flow along the curb is deep enough, then it goes into the bioretention cell and we take it out of the system. The tiny little details matter, right? You guys are like, under drains? What the heck is that? It made all the difference, and we modeled this too. There's a whole other paper where we modeled this in swim, and we show the same thing, that the bioretention cells are doing the work, and that taking out the under drains makes all the difference. We also talked to the people. You know, work with social scientists. My grad student got really into this, and so we ended up with a whole other paper. And I should say this is a master's thesis, and we got 3 papers out of it, so pretty awesome grad student in 2 years. So what did we find? We reviewed lots of documents. We did a survey. We talked to people. Again, we had this low participation even with incentives. We see that in other studies where they've even tried to pay people to adopt stormwater practices on their lots. Very low participation rates. because people view stormwater management as not an individual problem. Shouldn't the city be taking care of that, right? Why should I do it on my property? But we did see this social contagion. My favorite block is this one 87-year-old grandmother who was like, neighborhood beautification project, and she talked her neighbors into it. And we have 5 bioretention cells in a row. Next block down, there's none. Is that optimized from an engineering point of view? Absolutely not, right? But from a social point of view, it was incredibly important for us that our participants participate voluntarily. And we weren't gonna say, we're going to dig up your front yard without you, because people value their green space. And the last thing the park district wants to do and the city wants to do is get a bunch of antagonized people, right? After the project was over, we surveyed the homeowners. They could see what was happening. We didn't really share data with them. We just wanted their perceptions of whether this project was a success or not. And we found this really sharp divide. Those that had adopted green infrastructure loved it. They thought it was doing great things. Those that had not were really still pretty dismissive or even hostile to it. They thought, so their green infrastructure owners disagreed with the statement that it had created problems on their street. The non-owners, a significant fraction of them thought it had created problems. They thought it was trapping trash, or that it was increasing deer browse, or that they would fall into the garden. I look at that one funny, but that was an open-ended comment that we got. So all of this suggested to me that, yeah, there are things we can learn about the engineering of these systems. We can always do better. But man, the people, they're tricky. And if we really want to do this at a wide scale, we need to convince people to do it. We need to get the politics right. We also need to figure out how to pay for it. So this project was about $200,000. It affected 0.1% of the impervious surface in the larger watershed in which it is embedded. All right. So let me see how I'm doing on time. All right. So we want to scale up. That's our street where we manipulated. We want to know what's actually happening at the watershed. We cannot experiment on that whole watershed. We do not have the budget for that, but we can build a model for it. And so we built a SWOT model that represents the environment and has some LID algorithms that have been put in. So we're adding bioretention cells to all of the medium density urban development in this watershed, because that's the most common land use type. We use the USGS gauge at the mouth to calibrate and validate the data. And these are some sort of highlights of the results. So in every graph, they're all gonna kind of look like this. The red bar is the as-built conditions with very minimal stormwater treatment in place. And the circle is a central tendency. This is our range of uncertainty. Jargon, we take a Bayesian framework and we accept many parameter sets. And so this gray bar sort of represents our uncertainty around the as-built conditions. And then the blue bars are simulations with different levels of stormwater treatment, ranging from 5% all the way up to 71% of the impervious area in the watershed treated. 71% is 100% of the medium density development, right? So we're putting bioretention cells on every piece of impervious surface in places where people live. We see surface runoff decrease, awesome. We see that offset by increases in subsurface flow. That's what we expect, right? That's how a water balance works. And we're only changing less than 1% of the surface area of the watershed, and we are essentially taking areas that would be vegetated with grass and planting taller grass. So we don't see ET change in any meaningful way. But what is that doing to the hydrograph? We can change the water balance. Can we change the hydrograph? If we put enough on, and we are interested in the right things, yes. So for things like flashiness index, we see that go down. Time above mean flow, we see that go up. But notice it takes around 20% of the impervious area in the watershed treated before we see ourselves sort of escape the band of uncertainty, right? So that's a pretty significant investment in green infrastructure in order to get those hydrologic metrics to move in a detectable way. But those are not your favorite hydrologic metrics, you say. Well, we can calculate anything. That's the beauty of a model. The 1 month flow. Well, we can get there, but we're pretty much now we're basically convincing everybody to put a bioretention cell in on their property. That is maybe not socially realistic. Can we move the 1 year peak flow? No. Partly because bioretention cells in Ohio are not designed to treat the 1 year storm. They're designed to treat 3/4 of an inch of rain, which is about the 90th percentile storm. So we would be asking, if we set our environmental goal of stormwater management to reduce the 1-year peak flow, we'd be asking an unrealistic thing for the technology we're using. So we have to manage our expectations. We know subsurface flow is increasing. Are our low flows going up? Not really, not in any detectable way, but look at the size of some of these uncertainty bands. Urban watersheds are really hard to model. We gotta get all those natural processes right, and we have to get all the built environment right, and there are basically no modeling frameworks that can handle all that. And even if they attempt it, they become completely over-parameterized monstrosities, so you have big uncertainty bands associated with it. So some of this is a science, a modeling techniques problem, and some of it is a stormwater problem at this point. So what are the takeaways? At small scales, we know that source control works. At larger scales, it's gonna take a lot of investment to get a detectable effect. And we have to be realistic about our expectations. We cannot ask something that is hydrologically impossible of our system. And so, you know, if you're communicating with a stakeholder group or a policymaker, you might say, you know, it's not really realistic to decrease the 100-year flood in my urban watershed because I've added some rain gardens. It's just, we're not putting the storage into the system to do that. Models are a pain. Real data, even more painful. Remember my experimental watersheds, double paired watershed study? Second one, they ripped up the street in the middle of our study, and then they repaved it in really nice pavement, and stormwater didn't go down, but we think it's because in the past, stormwater could sort of fall off, the curb and gutter was all broken up, and the pavement had secondary permeability, and then they made the stormwater worse by repaving the street. Real data, it's a pain. So we need to manage expectations, we need to be communicating, and we also need to think about co-benefits. So maybe we can't win all the hydrologic metrics, but maybe we're increasing property values, or maybe we're creating habitat, or maybe there are other things that we can do along with stormwater management, and that will create the win that we need to also get the hydrologic benefit. Okay, so what's next? I just got funding, yay! We want to connect all these dots on the cumulative effects of stormwater management, starting with the people, making the decisions and understanding what's influencing particularly the institutional decision-making about stormwater management. Then my piece comes in and we're gonna look at how stormwater management is impacting flow regime in a number of watersheds in both the Cleveland area and Denver area. And then I didn't talk about these pieces over here, but of course they are receiving all of this. There's interactions between flow and water quality and ecosystems. And so if that sounds exciting, come work with me. Tell your friends looking for graduate school that we are recruiting a couple of graduate students on this project. More broadly, backing back out of stormwater, what do I think our field needs in the next several decades? Answering the challenge that Anne gave me. We need to really look at this idea of landscape capacitance and regional variation versus the idea of homogenization. And where do these two sort of, I could almost set them up as competing theories. Where does that work? Where does that not work? Both in terms of space and in terms of the type of hydrologic response that we're measuring. We've invested a lot in understanding Baltimore and Phoenix and the urban hydrology and urban ecology of Baltimore and Phoenix. Does that explain what's happening in Reno? Or in Denver, or in Cleveland, or in Charlotte? Right now, we don't know. So we need to start to figure that out. We need to embrace the underperformance of stormwater systems and the leakiness of pipes. These are things that we are missing in a lot of models. When I just modeled, I built thousands of bioretention cells in West Creek watershed. I assume they all work perfectly, even though all of my monitoring data says they don't all work perfectly, right? We need to figure out how to put that heterogeneity into our conceptualization and into our models. We need to talk about people. We need to really engage with social scientists and embrace socio-hydrologic frameworks. And we actually need to think about a knowledge co-production where people who are not hydrologists are thinking about helping us come up with the scientific questions that we're going to answer, the approaches we're going to use to answer them, helping us analyze the data and think about the data and thinking about the implications of the data. So we're involving stakeholders in all parts of the scientific process. We need to be thinking about longer timescales and thinking about climate change and climate variability and how our land use decisions that we are making now and are making in the future are going to have ripple effects I should have also said larger spatial scales because, of course, urban areas are not islands into themselves. They are, there's an urban metabolism. They're taking in materials fluxes and water from a much larger area to support what's going on in the city. So drawing that connection between the upstream watersheds and the urban areas is an important thing that we need to be doing. And we need to be talking and listening to the people that live there and the people that work in these systems. And we need to not just stop with publishing papers. Publishing papers is good, but if we're not communicating our science back to the people who live there, the people who work there, the people who are making decisions, our state and federal legislatures, then what is the point of the science that we're doing? Scientific knowledge for its own sake is great, but I work in human-altered environments in part because I want to help people, right? And so ultimately, I would argue that in a world where more and more of us are living in cities, where our infrastructure is aging and leaking, and I didn't even talk about the fact that we have 200-year-old pipes underneath our cities and we're not going to replace them for another 100 years, where environmental degradation is pervasive, and where climate change is just making everything worse, right? It's just intensifying the hot water cycle and exacerbating extremes, that if you want to do societally relevant hydrology, think about doing urban hydrology, because I really do truly believe that the future of hydrology is urban. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
A question I just have, if I'm a climate denier or a naysayer, would be, do we have sufficient information for what precipitation patterns will look like under changing climate in the next 50 years that we can feed into our hydrologic models to say, yeah, the one-day storm is going to increase in intensity or decrease?
If we think about this in sort of an ensemble sense, and where are these uncertainty bands moving, then I would say we do have some pretty good information. And also, one of the nice things about working in urban watersheds, and you end up talking to engineers, and engineers understand what the consequences of infrastructure failure are. And so there's some folks at Carnegie Mellon that have just done a really nice paper on how we need to build bigger stormwater pipes, right? So that we're not backing up our stormwater pipes and causing urban flooding. And there are different diameters that stormwater pipes come in. So do we need to size up one size, or do we need to size up two sizes? And that's where that sort of ensemble of uncertainty comes in. But I think that you can make a pretty good case of the consequences of not thinking about what climate futures look like have some pretty catastrophic implications, but the consequences of overbuilding are, yes, overspending money, but many times there are these flow-on benefits, like, oh, we're treating more than the design stormwater, how nice for us, our stream is now healthier, right? Or you've got a rain garden and you don't really need it most of the time, plant it with pretty flowers, right? So I do think, yeah, that is definitely a concern, but I think the nice thing in urban watersheds is the infrastructure language tends to kind of help us move past that uncertainty.
I guess my question would be, do you know if there are any tax write-offs or tax credits or that type of thing in Cleveland to respond to people having bioretention cells or rain gardens or similar?
Yeah, so that's a great question. How do we incentivize stormwater management? So at the individual level, a large number of cities in the US have some sort of stormwater fee, and that's usually based on the impervious surface in your property. That's how Charlotte gets its $25 million a year. So, it's not hard in a GIS layer to say that parcel has that % impervious surface or that amount of impervious surface, therefore your water bill goes up by $2 a month. So the funny thing is that this turned out to be a hugely legally contentious battle in Cleveland that only resolved a couple years ago, because is stormwater wastewater? It was our sewer district trying to implement the fee. And is it a fee or a tax? And it went all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court and got completely blocked up for a couple years, and then ultimately the Supreme Court said stormwater is wastewater, which is an interesting concept. And it is a fee, not a tax. And so now you have a fee based on your impervious surface, but if you build a rain garden or you put in rain barrels or you do this, that, or the other thing, you can get a fee rebate. However, if you start to look at the documentation of that, it would take a long time for a homeowner to pay back the cost of a rain barrel or a rain garden in their fee rebate. And so is that a real economic incentive or not? And so my collaborators and I, once the program finally got through the Supreme Court, were like, well, nobody's going to adopt because they're going to do the math and they're going to figure out it's going to take 4 years to pay for their rain barrel. And then the sewer district said, we have been inundated by requests. We did not expect the adoption volume that we got. So the people who wanted to adopt have adopted even if it doesn't make economic sense. But yes, so there are fees and there are economic levers. At the individual sort of homeowner scale, that economics may not be big. Now, if you are the industrial property with the 6-acre rooftop, your incentive to mitigate stormwater off your rooftop is huge, and that's actually why we got brought into that site. Like, what can we do at this site where we can't dig into the ground? This is a overbuilt factory where 10% of the buildings and parking lot are used now. How can we're paying this huge fee, thousands of dollars a month, what can we do to reduce our fee because we can't keep paying that fee? We don't have the economy to do it. And so their economics makes a real difference. Yeah. There's a question in the middle there.
So in response to the increased runoff from impervious surfaces, have there been any studies on replacing pavement with permeable pavers, or I've even seen a video, I think, about a type of pavement that allows water to run through it? Have there been any?
Yeah, so I would lump that in the sort of bin of, collectively there are thousands of studies on permeable pavement and permeable pavers. There are at least several dozen. It works. What it's doing depends on whether there's an underdrain or not. That perforated pipe, so your pavement or your pavers are on a gravel base, and someplace at the bottom of that there may be a perforated pipe that may be taking it back to the storm sewers. If that is the case, then you are slowing the flow down and you're providing some filtration, and those are good things, but you're not reducing volume, so you're doing nothing for the overall water balance. The bigger question we have with permeable, and there are caveats. You can't run on to permeable pavement. It's only designed to treat the rainfall that falls directly on it. So you can't put permeable pavement at the bottom of the hill and expect to solve the whole catchment. Leaves falling on it and sand getting into it. These are the sorts of nuances that a lot of engineers study. Like, how long does it take to clog a permeable pavement? But yes, there are studies on that. See a question over here.
How would we be able to work around this with Western water rights and prior appropriation?
So that's an interesting question. I am hoping that I have a much better answer about that in the next couple of years, because we're just getting this project that's in Denver going. So as you know, water law in the eastern US is totally different than water law in the western US. And my sense is that different sorts of stormwater controls are being built in the western US, partly driven by water law. The idea of infiltrating water and recharging it to groundwater could be like a no-go if that's some other receiving, somebody else downstream has the water right for that. So I think different things are being built in different places, and that's probably a good thing, not just legally, but also because of those sorts of natural landscape variability. I suspect in the long run we may also see some changes or nuances around the legal framework. But have me back in a few years when we've done the work in Denver, and I'll have a much better answer for that. Anne. Sorry, and then I see you in the middle, and I'll get you next.
Thanks, Anne. So programmatically, this is a really exciting topic, but this is not something that's typically taught in a hydrology or a hydrogeology program. So if you were to build or modify a hydrology or hydrogeology program, what kinds of skills and knowledge would you think that the students would need to have in order to address some of these urban hydrology challenges?
So we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but it's not a softball question. It's a tough question. A couple of the things that I've really come to appreciate working in urban systems is that they are systems, and we need to think about these interconnections in the surface and in the subsurface and between the humans and the engineering and the natural environment. And it's not as straightforward as there's topography and rain comes down and then we can do a water balance, because man, topography doesn't tell me anything about, well, okay, it tells me something. It doesn't tell me very much about how water is flowing in the urban environment. I need to understand all of those engineering systems and the social systems that have created the engineering systems in order to really understand the hydrology. And so a transition to systems thinking and how we teach that is not entirely clear, but maybe it's through practicum and for getting people digging into real world messy problems. I would also say working with big data sets, learning to code, but also working with messy data. Those are important things. And then finally, I can't stress this enough, if we're not communicating our science in multiple different forms, then what impact are we having? And that's true whether you're working in urban systems or whether you're working in wilderness areas. There are always stakeholders. And this communication of science and doing better science by listening to them, I think is critically important.
I'm going to say that here's a place where we can finally benefit from the activities of our university athletic departments. When I've done work in a city where I'm coming from the university that they go to the games of, okay, the population goes to the games of, I get much higher cooperation rates than I expected. Now, I don't know if that will hold true for the kind of permanent changes that you're asking for, but I'm wondering if you have had any experience with, just coming from the university with the right sports team. Has that ever helped you?
I don't think that either of the universities I've worked for necessarily have the right sports team. We managed to lose our homecoming game last weekend in the final 2 minutes, having been ahead the whole game. But actually I think there's this concept of boundary organizations, and organizations that are not just researchers, but they're not just community members, that are really serving this role of trusted agent both directions and of translator both directions. And for me, the boundary organizations have been things like park districts or watershed groups or conservancies that allow working and building relationships with their stakeholders and working and building relationships with me, and then help me get the science to the right audiences. So I work a lot with Cleveland Metro Parks. I work with West Creek Conservancy. I'm doing work with the National Park, and my God, in terms of motivated and buy-in, like the volunteers in the National Park are the most amazing group of people. And so, I don't know about sports, but that idea of establishing a common relationship and a common set of values, and maybe having this sort of guide on the side to help you do that, it can be an incredibly powerful tool. Oh, go ahead. Way in the back.
Hi. So this is likely a small impact, but I was wondering whether you've accounted for some of the changes in precipitation patterns, intensity, rate, distribution that we know happen in cities.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that sort of Scott ducked out, but it sort of gets back to Scott's question. So there are people working on issues around changing precipitation patterns within and downwind of cities. I have not done that. One of the issues that I'm struggling with right now, so I used to work a lot on climate change impacts, and I'd love to bring that back into my urban work, but Cleveland is really affected by the lake, and like, west of I-77, there's no snow, but east of I-77, there's lots of snow. But that's not resolvable in like GCM, like it's all 1 grid square, right? And it's not even picking up Lake Erie because that's not big enough to resolve. So getting those sort of high resolution information can be incredibly important. Not in a modeling framework, in a real world framework, we are certainly always after the best precipitation data sets we can get and putting weather stations up. And I just discovered that the sewer district maintains 20 rain gauges throughout the city at 5-minute intervals. I'm so jazzed because they're going to let me in and have that data. So yeah, getting the input right is as important in urban areas as any place else.
Hi. Early on, you talked about wetter areas becoming drier while drier areas becoming wetter.
In terms of the surface water expression, yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering why. Because I would expect wetter areas just to become wetter. Is it just their society's attitude around the area because they know that they have to adapt, or?
So wetter areas are becoming drier because of the infilling of lakes and wetlands, principally, and the burying of streams. Drier areas are becoming wetter because people like lakes, right? And so then they will build lakes in places like Phoenix and, have a subdivision around it. And so I think it's those drivers of, is the water in the way to start with, or is there not enough of it at the surface to start with? That's explaining some of that convergence on an equal density of water or an equal area.
Those are some excellent questions. I'm sorry to cut things off. I think Anne will be available for a few minutes after.
Yep.